Thank you. Good morning. This is a thrill to be here. I see an opportunity, just talking to the teachers yesterday, that I have an opportunity to, through you, influence thousands of young minds about the U.S.-China relations. And that's a thrill because my passion is U.S. and China and how the two countries can and should get along, because our future and our kids' future, our grandkids' future are dependent on having a much better based understanding than we have right now. I'm going to start, and the next three speakers, and I'm doing it, I'm kind of scoping them a bit, but next three speakers are going to be different. You've had some really solid, factual-based information briefing from yesterday and from Rosie today. Now you're going to get some contrarian opinions and ideas, maybe misinformation and disinformation, and I'm going to make no pretense of being fair and unbiased. I'm going to present a different point of view that you probably haven't seen or heard. But first, I was on a business trip in Beijing in May, and I knew I was going to do this workshop, so I thought I'd try to do a little slideshow just to change the pace a little bit, and let's see if it comes up. The music you already heard the music, so now we can see the picture. Okay, just watch. It's only a minute. Okay, that's it. And really, I was just trying to show the contrast from the traditional delicacy, scorpion on a skewer, costs about 2.5 times the ordinary lamb or beef on a skewer, right there on the most opulent street in Beijing. And then I took a shot at Zhongnanhai because that's where the high-ranking government officials live and work. And right in front, you see a car going by, but you still see bicycle riders going by as well. So with that, let me go to the meaty part of my talk. I come from not an academic point of view. I come from someone who, when Rosie said it started in 1978, well, that's when I started to go in. I was part of the Chase Manhattan team, and we were advising U.S. companies on how to do business in China. And I've been more or less involved ever since. So I've had this ringside seat watching China grow and change. And I have to confess, all the time I was there watching it grow and change, I could never see and project what China was going to become in that 30-some years. But I'm today oh yeah, thanks. So what I'm setting out to do today is to give you a point of view that is from a business consultant's point of view, but also a on-the-ground point of view. And I think it's going to be different from what you've been reading. In fact, I guarantee it's going to be different from what you're reading, okay? And why is it important? I think it's important to have a nuanced understanding of what China is and what it really is, or how China sees itself, because I'm very disturbed with the way the two countries are heading right now. And it seems to be inevitably that we're going to be heading into a collision path, and it's a very unnecessary collision path. And only through understanding and exchange are we going to be able to avoid this. So what are some of the big basic differences that we're talking about between U.S. and China? Well, first of all, Every year when comes June 4th, CNN and all the other places show you this picture of the guy with a couple of bags standing in front of the row of tanks, okay? So we are constantly reminded that the Tiananmen incident has never left China. Well, that was 24 years ago. A whole new generation has been born in China that don't remember or even know about the Tiananmen disturbance. And the other fact that most of you probably don't know, not a single shot was fired at Tiananmen Square. Not a single student was killed on Tiananmen Square, and that's a fact. But do you really know that from what you've read and what you heard about? You know, the killing that came was actually from the western side as the tanks was rolling in. But that's a separate point of view. Now, the other thing about it is China's view on the U.S. has also changed. Two traumatic experience changed China's attitude about U.S. 9/11 happened. Jiang Zemin was one of the leaders that called Bush to express condolences, to express support. That was the first change. 2008, the financial crisis hit, and the Chinese says, my God, what are we going to do with these trillions of US dollars, the value of which on a long-term basis is sliding continuous downward projection. So all of a sudden, heretofore, the leader of the world, the big brother that China was looking up to, has a feet of clay, or is wearing a paper tiger, the cloth of a paper tiger. So they too, the Chinese attitude about the U.S. has also changed as a result of these two traumatic events. How important was the U.S. relation to China? Well, we think about Nixon going to China. But here is People's Daily Extra Edition, dated December 16th, 1978. And what is this extra edition? It announces the intention of the two countries to normalize their relations starting January 1, 1979. It was that important to have an extra edition of People's Daily. The time that they had an extra edition previous to this was when they set off the atomic bomb, which is, I think, was about 1965, okay? Now, it's just a side note. What's important about the atomic bomb in 1965 was that U.S. and China had no connection, no relations, and therefore Chinese-American scientists could not have been the spies that leaked the atomic bomb secret to China. And that's important because throughout history in the U.S., whenever the position between U.S. and China is unfriendly, is tense, all of us become potential spies for China. This is the racist attitude that we have in this country that we have to face. Okay. Democracy versus one-party rule. Okay, clearly that's a very big difference. But I ask you about democracy. Are we here at one person, one vote in this country? Do you believe that? I believe it's $1 million one vote. I believe Wall Street and K Street together is lording it over Main Street. Main Street has no chance under this kind of a situation. I will talk more about the one-party rule in the following slide. Overwhelming shock and awe as part of the U.S. military strategy. What is China's strategy? I call it the porcupine defense. What do I mean by porcupine defense? When Kitty Hawk Armada was exercising in the Pacific, surrounded by hundreds of a flotilla of battleships, destroyers, and so on, one silent running Chinese sub popped up. Hello, everybody, and went away. The U.S. Navy went nuts because they didn't know that sub was there. Now, in order to prevent that happening again, it's going to take billions and billions of dollars of research and development. Chinese shot down one of their own satellites. Why did they do that? To show the American military they can. It's going to take billions and billions to try to defend against that. Okay. During the height of the Wen-Ho Lee scandal, when the Los Alamos scientist was accused of espionage, actually, one of the experts at Los Alamos on anti-espionage or counter-espionage, his name was Dan Silliman. The Chinese invited him to go to China to visit the atomic research capability that was going on over there. He came back and wrote a book, and the CIA or the government suppressed it, would not allow him to publish. But what is the Chinese intention? The Chinese intention is to let the U.S. know we have second strike capability. Second strike capability. We, China, has no interest in competing on hegemony. But we want you to know that we have it, we can hurt you back. That's the porcupine defense. The last point. As you know, since Iraq, Afghanistan, and who knows what else, there is no question that U.S. is the hegemon in the world. The doctrine is, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we can rule the world. Now, this used to be a fringe concept by the neoconservatives, but since George W. Bush, the neoconservatives is now the mainstream thought. And President Obama, unfortunately, has carried on this same philosophy. I call this the neocon poop strategy, okay? But that's the world that we live in. The Chinese strategy has always been to work within the United Nations, and I will comment more about it on another slide. So here's some references, sources that I recommend on the right side of your screen. As Paul mentioned, I write a blog. My latest one happens to be, the title is The U.S. Senate Hog Wild Over China's Bid for Smithfield Pork. Okay. And in there it says, our members of Congress are making a pig of themselves, picking every issue they can think of and try to relate it to U.S. security. But there are other issues that you'll find on my blog. A couple of TED Talks I would recommend, and some of you have mentioned it. One is by Eric Lee, and he makes a very strong defense on why the Chinese system works. The Martin Jacques talk is very interesting. Martin Jacques' wife was Malaysian Chinese. She died in Hong Kong because of discrimination and did not get the proper treatment that the Hong Kong hospital did not give her. And yet, Martin Jacques did not turn out to be a bitter man. He has steadfast, been very objective in explaining what China is. The last website I just recommend because it's a very comprehensive website, very carefully categorized and segmented, and it's usually a source that most people are not aware of. And I would recommend referring to it as it's chock full of information. So I'm going to, as an example, talk a little bit about the current leader of China and how he came to pass. And that's a contrast of democracy. This is a one-party rule and how it works. Now, I happened to be in Hong Kong about 2009, and they published a book. This is called basically a biography of Xi Jinping. And he had just been nominated as the likely successor to Hu Jintao, and he was a big surprise because even in China, they really didn't know who he was. His wife was many times more famous than he was, because she was an accomplished singer and a major general in the PLA. But let me just look at a little bit about how he came to become the #1 in China. During the Great Cultural Revolution, he was along all the youth of the privileged class were sent down to the countryside. For the first year, he couldn't stand it. He went back to Beijing, and his elders advised him to tough it out and go back, and he did. And for the next, how many years? For the next 5 years, basically, he worked hard, got it out, and became a contributing part of the local rural community. And he applied to be reinstated to the Communist Party, or applied to be admitted to the Communist Party. It took him 8 tries. Finally, the local officials helped him to become admitted. And he then was among the first group of what they call the Gonglongbing that was accepted to college when they reopened Tsinghua. And frankly, he was not a distinguished graduate because he didn't have the educational base to really take advantage of the college education, but he got a probably similar to our former president, got a gentleman's C to get through college. And he was then admitted to be the assistant to the West called it the Defense Ministry. I don't think that was correct. I think it was the PLA's administrative office, and he became the assistant or the secretary to the head of that office. But that turned out to serve him very well, because then he had built an early connection to the army. But then the other thing that's interesting was that once most of them, when they got reinstated and they got back to Beijing, most of them managed to stay in Beijing in different capacities, but not him. He specifically asked to be assigned to post out of Beijing, out of his comfort zone, because he wanted to serve. Public service was his objective, his goal. So from 1982 to 1996, basically for the next 14 years, he served at different local officials from very low-ranking areas, unimportant cities, villages and townships and so on, until he finally became the deputy party secretary of Fujian in 1996. Now, you know, in the Chinese hierarchy, the party secretary is a higher ranking than the governor. Okay? One's the CEO and the other one's the COO, sort of. So he really didn't become a prominent until he got to be, say, the party secretary of Zhejiang and a full member of the Central Committee in 2002. And then it was a very quick ascent. Party secretary of Shanghai, the most important city in China, and a member of the Politburo, and designated to become the successor to Hu Jintao. During this period, he made an impression on the people that he came into contact with as somebody that gets along with everybody, respectful of elders, fervently anti-corruption, follow the process of procedures of others. Unlike some of the local officials, when he was a local official, he did not start grandiose projects, big buildings that Rosie was talking about, for example. He basically said, we're not going to waste anything. We're going to follow through with what was done. We're going to develop things in a sensible way. And that caught the attention of Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, and that's why they made him the successor. Okay, that's the way the leaders of China has been selected. Now it helps, there's no question it does help that his father was an exemplary official who was one of the Zhou Enlai's right-hand man, who was disgraced during the Cultural Revolution but reinstated. And his father set an example by being a clean official that lived simply. he didn't even have a car or a driver during his period as an official. So let's talk about the different sources of friction between the U.S. and China. Trade imbalance, okay? Well, guess what? The way the U.S. economy works, it has a trade imbalance with nearly every country in the world, not just China, okay? Furthermore, the U.S. trade deficit that used to be with Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and others has all been shifted to China because all that manufacturing, the labor-added manufacturing, value-added manufacturing, left those places and have moved to China. And then the trade figures are distorted. A simple example, this is one of many, but the iPod, the music, the MP3 player, it comes into U.S. at an import value of $144, and Apple sells it for $299. The value added in China is $4. But in the trade statistics, the way it's counted, it counts like $144 came into the U.S., and all that is charged to China's account. And of course, that adds the distortion on the trade imbalance. Okay. So, according to our leaders in Congress, China is taking away our jobs. But actually, those jobs left the U.S. long time ago. They had gone to Mexico or Taiwan or elsewhere, and they just merely have gone to China. Currency manipulation. The renminbi was pegged to the dollar at $8.28 or $8.27, I think about 1997. Okay. And in 2005, finally, with so much pressure exerted by the U.S., it was allowed to float. And it has floated off and on between $8.28, now it's to about $6, 6.1 yuan to a dollar. About 35% appreciation. Does that satisfy our distinguished members of Congress? No. You know, it's still manipulation by the renminbi. Well, when China pegged the renminbi to the dollar, it did not know that the U.S. Fed was going to let the dollar weaken with time. You know, maybe if they had known, maybe they had consulted, they could have done it a little differently. Right? But even with 35% valuation up, it has not changed the trade deficit one bit, because that has nothing to do with this trade deficit we're talking about. Okay. In the meantime, because of the financial crisis and the lack of confidence in the dollar, the lack of Chinese confidence in the dollar, they have begun what they call bilateral swap agreements. Now, what's a bilateral swap agreement? It's the agreement between two countries, for example, China and South Korea. And they agree to settle their import-export, their trade, in their mutual currency, bypassing the need to change to dollars. And that minimizes, of course, the cost of exchange, but also minimizes exposure of holding dollars that may not be worth as much the next day. Okay. There are now 20 of these bilateral swap agreements going on between China and different countries. And some of the most important ones would be between China and Brazil, for example. All of this is a way of allowing a control currency, the renminbi, to float outside of China. And it's part of the preparation to the day when the renminbi will become freely convertible. And by most accounts, the projection is the renminbi will be convertible by 2015. And it will be very interesting because when that happens, China will become an alternative to the dollar as a reserve currency for other countries in the world. It will remain to be seen how appealing the dollar will be. Now, most people do not expect the dollar to disappear or to become the least preferred reserve currency. Dollar will still dominate for a long time to come, but there's no question a reflection that the value of the renminbi becomes an alternative as one of the basket of currencies. IP protection and cybersecurity. Professor Lin Xi-Wang and I wrote a piece. It's on my blog, but it's also in I think the New American Media, was it? Or anyway, the title has to do with China's hackathon. I thought we coined the word hackathon, but actually other people are using hackathon probably in the same way that we're using it, okay? Which is a marathon of hacking that's going on. Well, that article that we wrote is already obsolete and out of date because of the Snowden affair. Because what we were saying was, hey, look, the only country we know that has used the internet to hack was the United States. They used it, it's called Stuxnet, and they used it to put the Iranian centrifuge out of commission. And that was the only incident that is known to the world. Since then, of course, the US has been piling on about all the security threats coming from China. Now, there's no way Lin Xi and I could tell how much of it is real and how much of it isn't real. But thanks to Snowden, we know the biggest player in the internet is still the United States. And that shouldn't be any surprise. You know, Al Gore invented the internet. Well, actually, DARPA did. And we are, by far, the leader in the development of the internet. Now, the bottom line between 2008 and today, look at the bottom line, is this is the absolute change in the GDP over this period. China clearly outperformed the US, and Japan and EU didn't even increase, it went down the other way. Okay, we'll talk about a little bit about the international style between China and the US. China has steadfastly said, we don't want anybody to interfere with our internal policy, and we will not interfere with anybody else's domestic policy. And they have stood by that particular approach all along, okay? In Africa, the one that Rosie's going to be doing a study about, and there are admittedly criticism because of all the Chinese that has been flooding into Africa following the investments. But if somebody's doing a study on Angola, I forgot who it was. But I looked at I happened to look at the piece that they did in Congo. They built roads, they built schools, they built hospitals. And that's part of, they train the local Congolese in some of the jobs that it takes to do the mining. And they took as payment the ores, I think it was mostly copper, out as part of their investment. It's ostensibly and it's intentionally to be a win-win type of arrangement. So the blog that I happen to have there about Africa was interesting because Jacob Zuma, the president of South Africa, was in China at a conference and talked about Chinese investment in Africa. And he was very glowing on what he said about what China is doing. But he did say one sentence, and one sentence was that, you know, we need to balance the investment so that it's not so terribly one-sided, or something to that effect. And the Western media picked up that one sentence, and that was the only sentence they reported on. And it made it sound like South Africa was very unhappy with Chinese investment in Africa. And that was the piece I was getting at. The other piece that's very interesting that I put down is that a commentator was observing Obama's trip to Africa recently. And I commend you to read that article because it was a very balanced, fair observation about how Obama is following China into these countries, and neither of them are stepping on the toes of the other. Obama didn't say, hey, we're here, kick the Chinese out. Obama said, we're here to do our part, and what China is doing, we recognize is beneficial to Africa. Peacekeeping. Something that you all may not be aware of is that among the five permanent members of the Security Council, and that's US, Russia, British, French, and China, the Chinese have put up more peacekeeping forces, contributed more to peacekeeping forces than the other 4 countries combined. The Chinese have exercised the least number of vetoes, far away smaller than the US or the Russia. The next one with the minimum amount of veto was France. Now, some of the other issues that I have here, the Diaoyu Senkaku Island dispute. Let me just simply say, US made a big contribution on this debacle because the Diaoyu Islands was considered part of the Taiwan island, which was ceded to Japan in the 1894 war that the Manchu government lost. When, at the end of World War II, the terms of the conditions for unconditional surrender for Japan was to give all these islands back to Korea and to China. Well, Taiwan was given back to China, but the U.S. hung on to the administrative control of the Diaoyu Islands and did not give it back until 1972, well after World War II was over. And who did they give it back to? They gave the administrative control to Japan. And that's the source of conflict between China and U.S., China and Japan with U.S. complicity. Right. It has, the Western media seem to imply that the fight is because of hidden resources, the oil underneath the ocean floor. That's not it at all. The principle between China and Japan is that Japan has never apologized for the atrocities committed in World War II. We here in the U.S. is very willing and quick to forget about that, but it's very difficult for the Asian countries, whether it's Korea or China or Philippines and others, to have forgotten, especially when Japan refused to own up to fess up to what they've done. And that continues to today. And with the Abe government, I think the tension between the 2 countries is not likely to lessen with time. South China Sea dispute and the $9 line. You all know about the $9 lines that seems to cover all of South China Sea. Well, the $9 line did not start with the Chinese Communist government. The $9 line was there and claimed when the nationalist government was in charge of China. And what's the basis of their claim? And Lin Chi probably can explain that better than I can. But the basis of the claim was that China was a sovereignty, had control of those seas and islands before any of the other countries was even a nation. Philippines was not a nation. Vietnam was not a nation. They didn't have any claims. But China has publicly insisted that they are open and willing to negotiate on a bilateral basis with the countries in dispute. What they're not willing to do was multinational participation when other countries have no vested interest and no reason to participate in this discussion. So, North Korea. Well, I think China, and this is just my personal observation, I think China is very frustrated with North Korea. It doesn't seem to behave in a rational way. But the U.S. attitude is also not rational because Washington insists, hey, North Korea is your problem, control them, get rid of the nuclear weapons. And if North Korea collapses, that's okay. But the problem is there's no incentive for Beijing to do that. Because if North Korea collapses, South Korea takes over, and the American troops could move right into the border, on the border of Korea and China. I suggest, and not that it's going to work, but I suggest that Obama should have said to Xi Jinping, hey, if North Korea collapses and Korea unifies, we will immediately pull out. We Americans will immediately pull out and let Korea be one country without an American military presence. Because South Korea government does get along with Beijing very well. And that could be a beginning of a solution. Yeah. Okay. So, one last thing, dichotomy of China's view of the United States. You know, our Bay Area real estate property continues to go up. Why? Because a lot of Chinese come over here and pay cash for the houses, right? Palo Alto, Cupertino, any of these, all these places. Clearly, the Chinese people love it here. The air is clean, the weather is great, the roads are broad and nice, you know, and it's orderly. There's lots of things to be said about it, okay? The dichotomy is the Chinese people can't understand why the U.S. government treats China the way it's treating. Why is it that they see China as the next rival, as the next enemy of U.S. ambitions? And that's really the problem. I'm not going to talk about the Pew research other than the website is there because a couple of the people yesterday already talked about it. Let me just go to the very last slide. As a member of the Committee 100 that Paul mentioned, we promote seeking common grounds while respecting differences. We believe that U.S.-China relations must be built on that principle. Okay. The problem that we see today about everything being said about China, the distortion that happened is because the New York Times of this world insists on seeing China on their frame of reference, their comfortable frame of reference, not trying to understand and see China from other than their own frame of reference. You have to respect differences and try to find the common grounds to cooperate. So there's another prop that I have here. I recommend this book, A Great Wall by Patrick Tyler. Patrick Tyler was the head of New York Times desk in Beijing when he wrote, shortly after that he wrote this book. It describes the tortuous process each White House administration went through to accommodate China. The recognition that they have to deal with China in a little differently than whatever the rhetoric that Congress is spewing out all the time. And I was in China in 1999 during the 50th anniversary celebration, and I had already read this book, and I'm thinking, my God, this is a great book for the Chinese to have, because they need to understand what it takes for Washington to process this international relation and learning how to deal with China. And I was there in the celebration trying to figure out who I should give this book to, and I ran into a historical person that actually turned out to be a friend of the family, and that was Nancy Tang. Nancy Tang was the interpreter when Kissinger met with Mao, and she was the interpreter when Nixon went to see Mao in 1972. And she was a young lady then. She was a little bit older in 1999. But I gave her this book, and she looked at it and said, you know. Then I flipped to the index and showed where she was mentioned, and she was mentioned a number of times, great number of times. Then she was interested in this book. So, I think the other thing that I want to talk about, mention, is this website. This is a summary, and this is a website, a study on what the economic relationship can be like between U.S. and China for the next 10 years. And it's very important because it's not win-lose. It's not taking one from one pocket to put it in the other. It's how the two countries can really thrive together. And I think that's when we get the peace dividend at the end of the tunnel, if the two countries learn to get together. Now, from your teacher's point of view, why is it important to really know China? As Rosie said, we're living in a globalized world. If you can speak Chinese and understand China, your career options are going to be that much broader. You won't have to just depend on Silicon Valley, or you don't have to just depend on finding something in Detroit, or New York, but you could be a citizen and worker of the world. Questions? I also have this to show you. We can come up and see it. During the 50th National 50th celebration, they had a stamp depicting all 56 ethnic groups of China. And this is their way of showing how important it is. Every ethnic group in China is important. It's all 80 cent, it's not different denominations, the same denomination for every ethnic group. Han majority down to the Russians and some of the other, hardly any number exists group over here.
Thank you, Mr. Koo, for your comments. My question kind of goes back, though, to your reference to the win-win strategy for investment in Africa. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to that. My reading of it, at least what I understood, was it was heavily in extractive industries that really kind of fed the energy needs for China. So it started to look a little bit like old colonial policies. And that while maybe some of the leaders, you referenced Jacob Zuma, make it sound good and appear and shake hands, there's no doubt they have a history of being corrupt and following some patterns that aren't so attractive, where some of the grassroots people, the local people in some of these African communities may not see it as very win-win.
Well, at least in theory, what's in it for the grassroots people is employment, a chance to go to school, a chance to participate in the local economy that is growing as a result of the extractive industry that's going on. Certainly look at China and Australia, for example. Australia didn't have much to sell to China except what they can extract from the ground. And Australia economy has been growing in a huge amount because of their economic cooperation with China. Corrupt governments, well, yeah, that's part of the China's philosophy is we don't judge on whether the government is corrupt or not corrupt. When we come in and do a deal, there's no strings attached. And the difference between that approach and the foreign aid from the West is every foreign aid that goes in has a string attached. And that doesn't go over very well with the local governments. So, we may not like Mugabe, in Zimbabwe, all right? But China probably has a lot more influence and are able to do more for the Zimbabweans by being able to work in the government than to be standing on the outside and condemning the government.
Next question. Way in the back. Right there. Okay.
Well, I just wanted to follow up on that a little bit. I wonder if you can talk to some information that I've heard. Greg was mentioning about relationships with the government in Africa, but the purchase of land, because I've heard that China has purchased actually land in Africa, and then they're going to manage the land for their own benefit.
Yeah.
So.
Well, every time there's a buyer, there's a seller. Okay. Now, the appeal of African land is because Africa land is very rich. It grows a lot of things, and it grows food, agricultural products. The agricultural products that are grown on those lands are then used to feed the Chinese people. Right. But if you look at the total system of the world, if the Chinese people are not hungry, then there's going to be food left over for other people as well. Same point I made about the Smithfield pork thing, right? I mean, the pork capacity, the per capita consumption of pork in this country is going down. By buying this company and shipping the pork to China, it's going to be good employment for the agriculture, the hog farmers of this country. Why should you resent the Chinese taking the pork from here? The Chinese would tell you American pork doesn't taste as good as the free-range pork in China. But pork is pork, you know. And they happen to have a per capita consumption that's about 20% higher than the American per capita consumption. It's got to be a mutually beneficial type of arrangement. So if the land is fallow and not being used in Africa and somebody can come in and use it, it's going to be good for Africans as well.
I think we have the last question there.
Okay. Yes, hi, thank you. You mentioned 9/11, and I'm wondering what China's media coverage of 9/11 was. And I ask because I've met some students from China who don't seem to understand what happened to our country in 9/11, and I'm just wondering what the media coverage was like.
Well, I don't know exactly what the coverage was, but my understanding was the real-time coverage of the planes crashing into World Trade Center was shown in China. You know, CNN, for example, is readily available in China. And when upon seeing that, now Jiang Zemin picked up the phone and called Bush. Now, so he has, at least he has to have access to that type of thing. And you know, the media coverage in China is nowhere the totalitarian batten down the hatch approach whatsoever. If you go to China and you go into the hotel, you're up to date on what's going on in the world.